Beware, citizen, you are now departing from the world of allowable opinion. The Tom Woods Show.
Welcome, everybody. It's Wednesday, May 7th, 2014, and we are talking to Pat Buchanan today, who, among other things, is a Winston Churchill skeptic. He's an iconoclast when it comes to Winston, and I thought that would make for a good topic of discussion. Make sure you are subscribing to this program, by the way, because look at another precious gem that might have passed you by. We've got a very, very wide array of topics that we cover in commute-sized chunks. You can subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher via the links that you'll find at tomwoodsradio.com. Well, I'm sure you guys know Pat Buchanan. Pat has been a senior advisor to 3 presidents, a 2-time candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. In fact, he won the New Hampshire primary in 1996 and was the presidential nominee of the Reform Party in the year 2000. Pat has been a fixture of television for decades now, and he's the author of 10 books, including 6 straight New York Times bestsellers. The book we'll be talking about today is Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, How Britain Lost Its Empire and the West Lost the World. Pat, welcome to the program.
I'm delighted to be here, Tom.
Pat, there was a poll done that you actually reported on in your book that I just told everybody about in 2002, conducted by the BBC. They polled 1 million people, and Churchill was chosen as the greatest Briton of all time. So you got quite a long road to hoe here, Pat, in being a Churchill skeptic. So before we get into the reasons for skepticism, why don't you explain what it is that is attractive to people about Churchill? It basically boils down to 1940, doesn't it?
I think it boils down to 1940 and Churchill's role as an inspirational war leader at the time. The British were being thrown off the continent at Dunkirk, and you had the Battle of Britain with the British Spitfires against the Luftwaffe. And it was a great and historic moment, and Churchill was an inspirational leader, undeniably. And as that kind of war leader, I think he was certainly, peerless in World War II. But the problem with Winston Churchill's legacy is if you take his career from going into the First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911 to leaving as Prime Minister in 1945, that encompasses basically the bankruptcy and the breaking of Great Britain and the collapse of the British Empire, to which Winston Churchill contributed more than any other man.
Now, I want to go through sort of one by one some of the points that might be raised against Churchill, but before doing that, I wonder if you might take a moment to reflect on what it is about Churchill that the neoconservatives are especially attracted to. As I said, given from that, as we can see in that poll, everybody more or less admires Churchill. Like it or not, they all admire him. But the neocons are especially insistent on the Churchill cult, if we might call it that. Why is that?
I think that goes back, it goes back to 1940, but it goes back before then. They believe that Churchill was the great far-sighted leader who saw Hitler as a great menace earlier than anyone else, and who predicted his rise, and who spoke out against him when others did not, and who stood up against the Munich deal, and who led Great Britain against Nazi Germany, which the neoconservatives consider the great monstrous evil of all time, and him the one far-sighted leader who saw this. And I think if you read the neocons consistently, you will find they keep going back to the Munich Conference, to the Sudetenland, to the sellout of Czechoslovakia, and Churchill is the one man who stood against it. That is really the moment in their lives of the last century that was most critical. And so I think that's one of the major reasons they stick with Churchill. Even though if you look at the sweep of his entire career, it was a thoroughgoing disaster for the British Empire.
But from the point of view of 20th century history and totalitarianism, couldn't one say, though playing devil's advocate against you, that the fact that Churchill's decisions led ultimately to the downfall of the Nazis, the fact that he refused to take a negotiated peace, that he doggedly insisted on carrying on the war, that in turn led Hitler to engage in the invasion of the Soviet Union, as you argue in your book, to knock out the Soviets as a way of really isolating the British and bringing them to heel. Well, but of course the Soviet invasion led to the downfall of Hitler, as it turned out. So all these decisions made by Churchill led to the downfall of the Nazis. So no matter what you can bring against him, wouldn't you say that was nevertheless a life well lived? I mean, what could possibly be in the debit column if bringing the Nazis down is in his credit?
Well, what did Churchill want to go to war for? First, he wanted to go to war for Czechoslovakia to maintain that ramshackle state that had been set up at Versailles. Second, he thought they should go to war on behalf of Danzig and the Polish corridor and against the Nazi Germany for that. How did Czechoslovakia wind up? How did Poland wind up? The Poles lost somewhere between 5 and 6 million people in the war and ended up in the maw of Joseph Stalin, a man far more evil, far younger even from the beginning than even was Adolf Hitler, who killed many more millions than Adolf Hitler ever killed. The consequence of Churchill's desire to get into a war with Germany and to bring down Nazi Germany at all costs was success. He did help bring down Germany. His resistance and refusal to negotiate in 1940 to 1941 led Hitler to attack Great Britain, and then he declared war on the United States. So it brought Hitler down, and it brought Great Britain down, which was on food stamps in 1945, living off the Americans. It brought the British Empire down. It led to the death of 100 million people in Central and Eastern Europe, and indeed many in Western Europe, the complete destruction of Germany, and the fact that Stalin and the Americans, who pushed the British aside, then ruled the world. Now, if that's your great goal, that we're going to bring down Hitler even if we bring down everything else, I mean, that's the so-called Samson option.
Let me read to you, Pat, a couple passages from your own book. These are quotations from Churchill. This is Churchill in 1942 speaking about Stalin. He says, "This great rugged war chief, he is a man of massive, outstanding personality, suited to the somber and stormy times in which his life has been cast, a man of inexhaustible courage and willpower, and a man of direct and even blunt speech. Above all, he is a man with that saving sense of humor, which is of high importance to all men and all nations." He's a funny guy, that Stalin. "But particularly to great men and great nations. Stalin left upon me the impression of a deep, cool wisdom and a complete absence of illusions of any kind." I can't resist, Pat. I got to read a couple more. This is 1944. Yeah, this is Churchill addressing the House of Commons. "Profound changes have taken place in Soviet Russia. The Trotskyite form of communism has been completely wiped out. The religious side of Russian life has had a wonderful rebirth." And then finally at Yalta, "It is no exaggeration or compliment of a florid kind when I say that we regard Marshal Stalin's life as most precious to the hopes and hearts of all of us. I walk through this world with greater courage and hope when I find myself in a relation of friendship and intimacy with this great man whose fame has gone out not only over all Russia, but the world." Now, two comments, Pat, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. The first one is, the statement about the religious side of Russian life puts me in mind of an old story from Joe Sobran, who said that he was on a tour of Soviet Russia and he was being taken around in a tour bus and they were pointing out all the beautiful churches in Russia. And he said, "How many of those have been built since 1917? And of course, dead silence was the answer. But the other point is, couldn't you say, all right, well, this is understandable. These sorts of statements are over the top, but they're the sorts of things that you say in diplomatic situations."
Well, there's the second part of what you say. There's some truth to it. But when you come back and make these statements, which you had to know in his heart were utterly false. No one had written better or spoken better on Soviet Bolshevism in 1919 and 1920 than Winston Churchill. I mean, he talked to them in excoriating terms, what a dreadful bunch they all were. He knew this. And then to come back and to mislead his countrymen and speak in terms about Stalin, where Neville Chamberlain never spoke in those kinds of glowing terms about Adolf Hitler. He merely had come home and foolishly said, "It is peace for our time. I have his signature on this paper." And he's one of the great fools of history, we're told. How then can they defend Churchill? I can understand when you're sitting there in Yalta, as he was. I mean, I've been in Beijing writing toasts about Mao Zedong for Richard Nixon, which would make you throw up. But that's what you do on these diplomatic tours. But when you come home, you don't make statements like that, which are utterly deceptive to your own people about what is happening not only in Russia, but in Eastern Europe as Stalin is winning this war. Then you go back, Tom, and look at what Churchill did. He snuck into Moscow with what he called his naughty document, and he there decided basically to cede to Stalin, Romania, Bulgaria, 50% of Yugoslavia. In Greece, we British get 90-10, you get the 10. And then you find him a year later or 2 years later out there in Missouri saying an Iron Curtain has fallen across Europe. The Iron Curtain was exactly where he and Stalin were deciding it should fall.
You wrote in your book, Churchill's concessions at Moscow were far worse than Chamberlain's at Munich.
Exactly. I mean, what did Chamberlain concede at Munich? At the Sudetenlanders who had been taken away from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and put under Czech rule against their will and against the promises of Wilson and against the right of self-determination, wanted to go back to the German rule. By then Hitler had taken over Austria, but they wanted to go back to the rule of Germans. And what was Chamberlain supposed to do? We're going to fight another world war against Germany, and once we win the war against Germany, we're going to put these Germans back under Czech rule? I mean, there was no cause for which the British should have gone to war, in my judgment. That doesn't exonerate Chamberlain from how he handled it. But that was basically Chamberlain acceding to the inevitable and accepting the inevitable and letting people leave Czechoslovakia to go where they wanted. Listen to the Poles who fought alongside the British. They didn't want to be under Joseph Stalin's rule. They resisted it. They had fought Stalin's regime in 1920. So what Churchill did was infinitely worse than what Chamberlain did at Munich.
Pat, tell us about the Morgenthau Plan and what Churchill's views on it were.
The Morgenthau Plan was devised by Henry Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of the Treasury under FDR, and whose first deputy was Harry Dexter White, who was a Soviet spy. And the Morgenthau Plan was designed at the end of the war to deindustrialize Germany and turn it into a pastoral country, which would have meant the death of millions of Germans. And this was presented to Stalin at Quebec, at the conference in Quebec, and Stalin resisted, and then Churchill resisted, then it was pushed upon him, and he tried to impose it upon his own government, and he got behind this plan, basically, which would have been one of the monstrous war crimes of all time, somewhat along the lines of what Stalin did in the Ukraine. And Winston Churchill got behind it. Fortunately, it was leaked to the American press late in the war, and the American press, and I can remember as a kid, my father talking about the Morgenthau Plan, what an outrageous and horrible and un-American thing this was. And, of course, FDR, as expected, ran away from it. But Churchill had come out for it. It was appalling.
Now that puts me in mind anyway of what wound up happening to some of the Germans after the war who had to be relocated in order for the various territorial concessions to work. And you wound up having, 2 million dead Germans? I think most people don't know anything about that.
Like, at the end of the war, because of the way Churchill was the one who sat down at Yalta and showed Stalin how they were going to move Poland to the west by ceding the sections of Poland that Stalin had seized in concert with Hitler. He would keep those, and then Poland would be rewarded with German territory. And what happened was the Germans of Pomerania and the Germans of East Prussia and the Germans of the Sudetenland, all of these people were driven like cattle out of lands on which they had lived for centuries, their families had. And in this massive exodus, there were rapes and murders and people dying of starvation and people dying of various things. And something like 13 to 15 million Germans, by final count, were ethnically cleansed from lands on which they had lived their entire lives and their families had lived. And they were pushed over into West Germany and into East Germany. And so Germany was reduced in size, and parts of it were simply annexed. You take a look at what they call Kaliningrad now. That is Königsberg, the home of Immanuel Kant. And now the Russians have renamed it. It's a little slice between Poland and Lithuania that they've got. But all the Germans were driven out of these places. Now, this is a monstrous war crime.
I'm reading right here from your book a statement by Solzhenitsyn, who has more moral authority than all these politicians put together. And he's talking, this is in the context of Britain's treatment of the Cossacks. He says, in their own countries, FDR and Churchill are honored as embodiments of statesmanlike wisdom. To us, in our Russian prison conversations, their consistent short-sightedness and stupidity stood out as astonishingly obvious. A comment?
Well, it's not only obvious, it's worse than that. And with regard to the Cossacks, what Truman agreed to, Operation Orange, and there's another name for that operation, whereby all Russian prisoners of war were sent back to the Soviet Union, to Stalin, and you can imagine what happened to them, several million. The famous Vlasov's army, General Vlasov, who was a Russian commander, had been captured, and he agreed to lead units in battle against Stalin's army. He was sent back and hanged, I believe, in 1946. But millions of these POWs were sent back. But the terrible tragedy was Cossacks and others were sent back who had not fought against the Russian army, who had simply fled after the Red-White Civil War in Russia from about 1919 to 1922. They had fled, and their families were sent back. I think it was William Sloane Coffin, was a soldier during the war. Now, you would have to check this, was a soldier during the war, and he was one of those in charge of putting these Russian prisoners on these trains, and he said they would smash their heads through the window and rub their throats on the broken glass to kill themselves before they got back to Russia. And Keel Hall was the name of it.
Yeah.
Operation Keel Hall. Folks should read that. And these Russians were all sent back, and I'm sure they were not just Russians, because the Soviet Union, they were, I'm sure, Ukrainians and Belarusians and others who were in the Red Army, who were all sent back to Stalin and to death. And this is something on which Truman signed on to, as did Winston Churchill.
You know, Pat, a historian you and I like, probably with some reservations, is Paul Johnson. I think he has some neoconservative inclinations, but even he, looking on the war years, doubtless has some sympathy for Churchill, but is appalled at the decision to bomb civilian centers. Who really started that practice? Well,
it was the great man himself, Winston Churchill. Is my recollection. The Germans went into Denmark and Norway, and this was one of Churchill's follies. Apparently, Churchill had blabbed that he was going to move ships into northern Norway and go across, Sweden and then help the Finns. And word got to Hitler, and Hitler sent Admiral Raeder, and he got there 24 hours before the British. So he captured Norway, and so as a consequence of that, that came about, and then you had, I believe it was April 10th. I think that the German army came west, and it was April 11th, I believe, that Churchill ordered bombing not of the bridges on not on the Rhine or on the French rivers, but of the bridges, and not of the bridges. He wasn't bombing them. He went and bombed the cities in Westphalia. It was the first bombing of cities undertaken in World War II. When FDR had said, "Let's hope to the Lord we don't have bombing of cities" when the war began, and Churchill began that, and he got a warning from Hitler about this, and he continued to bomb, and he said, "This is the only way, once they're thrown off the continent, the only way we can punish the Germans is by bombing their cities. We can't reach their armies. We can't get back across the Channel. We can't get into Norway, but we can bomb their cities." And Churchill began the systematic bombing of cities, and Coventry and London were retaliations for what Winston Churchill himself had begun. And, of course, if you read about Dresden, he was the one responsible for that unnecessary massacre.
Now, in terms of, again, looking at the broad sweep of 20th century history, What would have happened if there had been no Churchill, or beyond that, what would have happened if there had been no British war guarantee to Poland? I mean, I realize that this brings in the entire thesis of what is quite a substantial book, but I think you're probably can give us the.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. So, what's the Reader's Digest answer to that?
All right. Let me. My belief is this, and I think it's valid. Hitler came to power. He was determined to bring the Germans back under German rule that had been moved away from them in Versailles. And he unified with Austria. He got the Sudeten Germans back. He got the Germans back in Memel up in Lithuania. And he wanted to bring the Germans back in Danzig. He never wanted war with Great Britain. He admired the British Empire. He saw the world as four great powers, the Americans in the Western Hemisphere, the British Empire, Germany, and Japan. He was anti-Bolshevik to the core. And, of course, he was viciously anti-Semitic. But what he wanted, and take a look at the record of Hitler, he never demanded the return of Alsace-Lorraine, which had been taken away from Germany at the end of World War I. He never demanded the return of South Tyrol, which had been given to Italy and taken away from his own country, Austria. He never demanded the return of Eupen and Malmedy in Belgium, or of the parts of Denmark, which had gone to Denmark after a plebiscite. He was moving eastward. And you read his statements, he said, we turn away from our policy toward the west and we turn to the east. I think that if the Great Britain and France had not given the war guarantee to Poland, and Hitler had gotten into a war with Poland, that what the British should have done is send their troops to France, get behind the Maginot Line, and tell Hitler, if you cross this red line, we are at war. I don't believe he would ever have crossed it. There was nothing he wanted in the West. When he won France, he went there, spent 3 days, went back home. He never demanded the French fleet. He never demanded to take control of Syria, where he could have attacked the Suez Canal. He wanted to end the war with the British, whom he admired. And I've reread parts of my book. He said, if they just give me back one or two of my colonies, in other words, to show that I have done a victorious thing here, I'm willing to end this war. He desperately did not want to go to war with the British. He wanted to end the war with the British. It was Churchill who was determined not to end the war with Germany and to keep it going until Russia and or the United States came in. And they finished off Germany. And Churchill won that battle. And Hitler went down, and Germany went down in flames and ashes, and the British Empire went down, and Churchill won the game. What did he get?
Well, Pat, of course, the final question that would be on everybody's mind after all this, and of course we've focused primarily on just one chapter of your book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, the Churchill chapter, but people want to know, what about what happened to the Jews? I mean, at least certainly by wiping out the Nazis, many, many Jewish lives were saved is the conventional wisdom, and you dissent from that. When
did the Holocaust begin? There are two different views. One is it began when Hitler invaded Russia, and the Einsatzgruppen followed the German army in, and they were initially killing, as I understand it, the commissars of the Soviet Union and the Red Army, many of whom were Jewish. Others say that the Einsatzgruppen were even killing civilians. So let's say the Holocaust began in late June of 1941, and then the Swansea Conference, where the train started moving after that was held in late January of 1942. Now let's suppose that Hitler had gone in to Poland and taken it himself, or split it with Stalin. And Great Britain says, well, we couldn't help them, and so we're going to end the war now. There is no Holocaust because the Holocaust did not begin until over a year later. So why would Hitler go about putting Jews on trains to work camps and things like that if he was not at war? I mean, this is my view. The whole Second World War could have been stopped, I think, if Great Britain had said, we've done our best, we fought in France, we've lost, we won the Battle of Britain, and we will not give up a single possession, but we will have a truce or an armistice with the Germans. I think that would have been the end of the war. Why would Hitler have started another war? And if he did, where was he going to go?
Pat, when you wrote this book, I think it was a time when everyone would not have begrudged you a quiet retirement. You know, you've written and said a lot of controversial things over the years. You've taken a lot of unjustified abuse over the years. You could have just written your column and had that be that. But something compelled you to take on one of the sacredest of sacred cows in the whole world, which is the subject of this war and of Churchill in particular. I just want to know, as a parting note, what made you do it?
Well, it's fundamentally, I think World War I and World War II will be seen as the death blows of Western civilization. I think from 1914, I would say, to 1945, Western civilization, part of it had been torn away, they had gone heretical in Russia and Germany. Western civilization fundamentally destroyed itself. And I don't think it's going to survive it. I think you take a look at the demographic trends and everything. And so you ask yourself, how in heaven's name did this happen, and was this avoidable? Now, let me say this. On World War I and Versailles, I think the views I presented in there, and even in Great Britain getting into the war, they are now far less controversial than they were. Many people accept that Hitler, as that Lady Astor said, that asked where Hitler was born, she said Versailles. So you go back into before World War I, it was the British Empire that brought everybody in, made it a world war. And then you go to World War II, and you see all the death and destruction, and everybody agrees Hitler is a monster and an evil person, and Stalin is a monster and an evil person. But were these wars necessary? And even Winston Churchill, the title, The Unnecessary War, that came from Churchill. He told FDR, as soon as he came over, when the Americans got into the war, we ought to call this the unnecessary war. And so I wanted to find out, to my best satisfaction, were the wars avoidable, who made the mistakes, who made the blunders, or is the conventional wisdom true that Chamberlain was responsible for it all? And what I came to the conclusion is, Churchill was in many ways a great man with gifts beyond many other men of that century or any century. But as someone said, great men are rarely good men. And I think Winston Churchill is the prime culprit in the decline and fall of the British Empire. And I think he's the principal actor in having brought Great Britain into two unnecessary wars against Germany. People forget. The Germans never declared war on Great Britain. Britain declared war on Germany twice.
Pat, as I close, I want to just let you know I have a lot of libertarian...
Will you speak at my funeral?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I have a lot of libertarian listeners, and one of the great economic historians we have is a guy named Robert Higgs. You may be familiar with his work. And
right.
he just praises this book of yours to the skies. He says that the judgments in here are sober and judicious. They're based on very wide reading. He can find nothing to quibble with in this book. It lays out the thesis very, very provocatively but persuasively. And I would also add that most official libertarians who are located in D.C. or who run magazines will run completely in the other direction when this subject comes up. But you combine them all, roll them up into a ball, and put them to a side, their opinion isn't worth the one opinion of Bob Higgs. So I want to urge people to check out this book. Even though it came out in 2008, it's not a fresh new book. The ideas in here are ones that people have got to be familiar with, and there are a lot of important historians. We didn't even get to the military strategy issue, because we think of Churchill as a great military strategist. We didn't even get to that. Or his views on race, which were extreme even by the standards of his day.
Well, there's no question about, the views on race, they are extreme by the standards of the day. But I will say this, the book, I've read, I've got right behind me something like 120 volumes, and about, I would say, most 80 or so deal with the British role in the two world wars. And these views that in this book are not unique to me. They come out of British writers and authors I respect. Men like A.J.P. Taylor on the naval agreement. Paul Johnson agrees with me. Arthur Herman agrees with me. There are American historians and British historians that there's no doubt when you once you move into the pre-World War II, there is a set belief, the court historians, if you will, have prevailed. But even there, I was invited over on the 70th anniversary of 1939 to debate in London, and they had to move it to a larger theater, and it was 1,800 people. We started out with 10-1 voted against me, but by the end it was only 7-1.
That's not bad.
No, but I think people are now open. People are asking themselves, how in heaven's name could tough, intelligent men and empires and statesmen go into one after another of these cataclysms, the outcome of which, even if you got Hitler dead in his bunker, for heaven's sake, somebody could have shot him and ended the thing, would do 100 million in a civilization have to die for this? And so I think if folks will sit down and read that book, I think they will see let me say this, I know it was controversial, but I'm immensely proud of that book and proud of having done it and having sat down and written it and done all that reading.
Well, when it came out, for what it was worth, I played a small role in cheerleading for it. We had a symposium on it in the American Conservative magazine, and people said nice things about it. Everybody had some hemming and hawing to do, but I just came out with guns blazing, saying, thank God for Pat Buchanan coming out and doing this for us.
Well, I appreciate it immensely. Good luck. It's again, it is such an important subject. And it's, in terms of the history of our civilization, it's almost impossible to think, when you have to go back, frankly, to the Holy Land and 2,000 years ago to find a more important subject for Western civilization, I think, than what happened in these two world wars. It just destroyed so much of what was so good about the West and so good about the world.
Well, Pat, we're grateful to you for tackling that and for your generosity with your time today. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, my friend.
All right, everybody, that's Pat Buchanan. Buchanan.org is the website, and the book is Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. Well, one quick note. The other day I gave you guys a coupon code. I didn't realize it had expired until somebody wrote to me and told me, so we fixed it. So we are still running our 50% off promotion at libertyclassroom.com, where you can learn the history and economics they didn't teach you in courses taught by me and by other faculty members I trust that you can listen to in your car. We got Q&A forums to answer all your questions and much more. So check that out at libertyclassroom.com using coupon code DISCOUNT in all caps. All right, everybody, thanks for listening. We'll see you tomorrow.
The Tom Woods Show.